works, so I always talk over it. But I think we're live now, but then I have to wait because there's this weird thing where it will start playing and causing all sorts of noise in the background.
I've done some lives in my day, and it's uh
I always talk over it.
it's a difficult thing to execute perfectly without a producer and a yeah.
Right. And this is where my passion for mediocrity really saves me here is that my original YouTube channel was called Awesome Stuff Badly. That's when I started my startup in 2014. And it's like, okay, um, the way we inspire greatness in others is them seeing our audacious daring and failure. Because have you heard of the 10,000 hours to become an expert?
I have heard of that, yeah.
Everyone's heard of that. What people don't tell you about is the 20 hours of suck to not be a horrible beginner. And going through the 20 hours of suck is critical to getting to the 10,000 hours. And most people don't want to deal with that, or they get tired, 5 or 10 hours into it and give up. And so I have decided that my biggest legacy is abject public failure against worthy goals so that people realize that, like, hey, if this idiot can do that much despite failing miserably, maybe I could do a little bit better. In fact, the high point of my life was when my son was 6 years old, actually, maybe younger. 6 year old, he did my startup with me. 4 years old, I think it was. We were in India and he was playing on a swing set at his mom's college. And he looks at me and he goes, when I grow up, I want to do everything daddy does, only better. And like, that's kind of the goal is to create a record of inspiring people to do better rather than uh, thinking that they need to be perfect. They just need to do equally worthy things and suck less at it, and they will. Ideally, of course, they will do, even more worthy things excellently, but that comes much later. And so, and so yes, so maybe this is a good point to start the interview of what is the amazing thing that you would like to do, even if you have to do it badly at first.
Yeah, I think right now, in a very simple way, it's telling stories. And um I've I'm starting to challenge my identity as a videographer per our last call. And I think I've started to realize that my identity in terms of like a professional functional capacity is a storyteller, and that maybe I'm not very good at it, but I'm learning. And yeah, I think it's how do I help myself and others grow in storytelling, and what powers are there in storytelling that maybe aren't a product of my wisdom or insight, but just my alignment with God's wisdom or insight in enough of a sense that it can become helpful and useful and reflecting to others something about the nature of the world we live in, and give us language to talk about matters of the heart, which are oftentimes elusive to the mind.
Okay, so let me repeat back what I heard you say is that you feel like that maybe the quest you're on is about telling stories and helping others learn how to tell stories. And in particular, there's you want them to tell stories from the heart. And you want to give them language, whether that's verbal or visual languages, to tell these heart stories. And there was something in there about God's wisdom, but I didn't quite figure out I didn't quite catch how that related.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a story, in any story, there's a setting, right? There's a world you live in. And if you read a fantasy story, my wife is a big fantasy novel reader, and she's writing a something of a fantasy novel right now. When you write a fantasy novel, from what she tells me, there are certain rules that you break or that you change for your new world. But there are other rules that you don't break, and you have to actually follow more of the rules to the world that we know than you break, because it becomes difficult to follow. And so, in Star Wars, you still have gravity, and you still have time, and you still have uh human communication and relationships. There's so many things that are the same, and then there are some things that are different. Like now there's a force, or now there's lightsabers, or you
Mhm.
can travel at the speed of light, or maybe not the speed of light, but
You can warp, yeah, you can warp across space, yeah.
and these are clearly breaking the rules of our world. And so I think when I talk about God's wisdom, God created the world with these rules. And I believe one of the things that we're doing when we tell a story is we're actually reflecting on the rules that we can't bend. And whether you aspire to the world being created by God or not, there's obviously rules, the limitations of what we can and can't do. And so I believe by understanding those limitations, we can better navigate through them. So the limitations of gravity tells me, that I can't trim my tree without getting a ladder. And that's a helpful realization. Uh, but if we start to understand story and how it works, then we can even sort of in a certain way feel and see and sense story as a real thing. We can watch a movie and say that story was compelling, and then watch another one and say that story wasn't compelling, and start to analyze why. And I think what we start to see, like when we understand gravity, is some of the rules of how God created the world to work. And by leaning into those realities, rules, or wisdom of God, we can start to see what's going on inside of ourselves with more clarity. And that clarity, it gives us the right perspective to understand how we work and why we're not working, why our hearts are broken or why they're dysfunctional. And so I think, it's impossible for me to say, or I would choose not to say that it's through deep thinking and conversation that I've discovered how to reflect rightly on my own story, but it's actually through prayer and valuing the history of the world through God's perspective, that I'm able to see rightly my own story and my own journey, and to understand the rules of it and understand what's working and what's not working inside myself.
Interesting. And so a big part of this is not so much about creating a change in the external world, but helping people more properly understand their internal world.
Yeah, so like every story has external tension, internal tension. Well, I say every story, every real human story, the stories that we're living. Some stories we watch in movies, they only have external tension. We watch Mighty Ducks, and are they going to win the championship? Is the external tension, and there's a real reality around, what's the score at the end of the last game in that movie, to determine whether or not they're a success or a failure, or whether they are the winners or the losers of that championship game. That's the external tension. And the other external tension is, will the relationship of the coach to his boss survive? Will his relationship with one of the players' moms blossom into something? There's these other external realities of marriage or career or finances that create real external tension. Internal tension is this reality of, am I at peace? Am I known? Am I loved? Am I valued? Do I
Will I
understand?
choose success over relationships? And yeah,
And we can have a story that ignores the internal tension and internal reality. And I think of Michael Phelps, who's won 28 medals. I think 23 of them are gold, and he competed in 5 Olympics. Won, didn't win any medals in his first Olympic, and won the rest in the next 4. And after the 2012 Olympics, he said that he wanted to quit the sport, and he wanted to not be alive anymore. And he had reached an incredible amount of success and had resolved all the external tension in his story incredibly well, but the internal tension inside of him had not been resolved. And so, despite having resolved the external tension, his internal tension was still fully present. And these things are connected, right? The internal tension, to be important, to be valuable, to be loved or seen probably drove him to win all those medals. But once he won all those medals, it didn't answer the questions that plagued him on the inside. So there is something connected between these external tensions and internal tensions, but unfortunately, it's not as easy as if I resolve the external tension, the internal tension will get resolved as well.
Right. Is the converse true?
Yeah, well, I think you could say, for example, I have things in my life, external tensions that have not been resolved, brokenness in relationship that I don't have the ability to restore because the other person doesn't want to, or, um, I haven't succeeded on a career level the way that I maybe would imagine. And I actually think that the external tensions of our life are an invitation into resolution of the internal tensions. But we have to handle them rightly. If I handle the external tensions in a way that that I utilize them to see my own heart and to bring clarity to the tension of my own heart and to resolve it, then I can resolve the internal tension before the external tension's been resolved, and maybe never will be resolved. That could be where I come to peace with the fact that I have a broken relationship, or come to peace with the fact that my career has not been as successful as it could be. And I'm still aware that I'm loved. I'm still aware that I'm valuable. I'm still recognizing my identity, regardless of the external tension not being resolved. To me, that is the ideal pathway. Then from there, I could have certain external tensions resolved as a result of that, or maybe unrelated to that. I think the key with all of this is recognizing that we're talking about the story of the heart, and we'd all like the story of our heart to be settled by business success, but it just doesn't work. And so this whole process of story is actually saying, can we find some resolution for our hearts? And I think the answer is yes. And I think, fortunately, for many, it's not as related to the external tensions being resolved as we might think.
Interesting. So in terms of and I certainly resonate with this idea that there's usually the story starts with an external tension, right? The triggering event where there's a gap between, perceived and desired reality. And then that plunges the hero into a series of experiences that ideally highlight the internal tension, right? And then if the hero overcomes or resolves the internal tension, either they succeed in the original external prompt, or maybe they grieve it and accept a different reality. And either of those outcomes is considered a positive ending, right? And there's an interesting parallel between achieve and grieve, right? And but either of those is the end of a story, right? And I guess both of those could count as resolutions.
Oh, 100% they do. Yeah, this is the reality when you watch a movie, that you want a satisfying ending. And we both fully understand that a satisfying ending could be that the character loses the championship game, but they learn something about themselves and what really matters. And we all understand that that is a resolution, and a valuable resolution. What's interesting is there are many stories that are being told where the internal tension's being skirted or ignored or not addressed, or where there's internal tension at the beginning of the story and at the end of the story, and the seemingly offered resolution of the story is that internal tension is a human experience that has no meaning and no potential of resolution, because all of us live in tension all the time. My day is full of tension, as is yours, around, will I succeed? Will I use my time correctly? Will I make the right decisions? Will I navigate relationships well? And all of us have more unresolved tension than resolved tension by a long shot. And unresolved tension is not a story. It has all the potential of a story, but it doesn't become a story until it's resolved. And there's something that's actually said in resolution of a story that indicates that there's meaning. If the resolution of tension in my heart happens, it indicates that my heart, there's something true in my heart. There's something real that happens. And so there is a certain approach to story that's become more and more popular. You could call it a postmodern storytelling, where the resolution of the story is there is no resolution, or the meaning of the story is there is no meaning. And what the resolution becomes, which is interesting because it is a certain kind of resolution, is that I'm at peace with the fact that things didn't happen or that they didn't matter, or I just enjoyed life as it came to me with no meaning or no purpose. Garden State would be a good example of this kind of movie. I can think of others. Or where there's a confused resolution, like Frozen, the kids cartoon. It has a resolution, but if you play out the resolution with the tension I'm talking about, it doesn't make sense to me. It's like they skip over some key steps and force a resolution that doesn't seem real. And so we all kind of understand the rules of story. And if you watch a movie that doesn't have a compelling story, you could say it's actually frustrating or isn't a good movie. So there's something that seems to be maybe universal in our understanding of what makes a good story and what makes it feel good and compelling. But that's obviously being challenged by many movie directors today. And
Right. So I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to claim that Frozen wasn't a compelling story given the massive amount of commercial success. So rather than making an objective statement, it sounds like there's an interesting point of view you have that even stories that other people find compelling don't address the purpose that you want to accomplish with the story, right? And I think that's a really interesting insight because there's something about the kind of stories you want to tell that is subtly but importantly distinct from just what people enjoy.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a reality that a movie that has had a lot of views, or sorry, a lot of, I think of YouTube, a movie that made a lot at the box office. You know, if you go look at the top 20 highest grossing films, I wouldn't say that they're, a reflection of the top 20 most highly rated films. You know, if you compare IMDb's top 100 list to the list of top 100 grossing films, you would find some overlap, but mostly not. And this is the reality that we can actually sell a movie without it having a story. And there's actually something about stories that makes them sell, or sorry, movies that makes them sell that has nothing to do with story. And
there's spectacle versus story and all that. But yeah, but like, I don't even want to get into the whole ratings game and the metrics you use. I'm trying to understand, what is your heart? What is the thing that you think matters?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to this reality that I believe the human heart has inside of it certain built-in questions that are being asked. What's the point? Who am I? Do I matter? Am I seen? Am I heard? Am I loved? And those questions are built into us and they drive us. And when we reflect on our lives, we have to recognize that we are actually not the product of our own creativity or our own decisions or insight. We're put into a world with a setting, we're put into a world with a purpose and a backstory, all these things. And my inclination would be that that there is a God who designed those stories that we engage, even the brokenness of them, and that he's inviting us to see the meaning that he's writing into the story and the redemption he's bringing to our story. And when we ignore that, we miss the ability to answer those questions. And some might say, I could go answer those questions without God. And, I haven't gone down that journey or explored that myself, but the evidence that I've seen indicates that with the anxiety and depression, off the charts, I don't think that we're actually finding resolution to our stories. We could say this is resolution, or this is what I perceive as the meaning of it, but I think there's something in the human experience that's unresolved, apart from answering these questions the way we were designed to answer them.
Right. And I think that this is the idea of a point of view.
Yes.
You're coming from, right?
Yes.
And the point of view is that meaning is not something that we create from scratch, nor is it something that is absent. is this idea that we are embedded in a story that already has meaning, and that there is something that we can uncover and also shape, or at least contribute to in some significant way.
Agreed.
Okay, and so that's the um okay. So there's a framework that I've been looking at, and it's a distinct riff on the traditional mission statement piece, and I find it a useful frame to talk about uh, what you're trying to accomplish. And it's actually not a bad uh, version of a plot analysis either, right? Is you can use this to apply to a character in a movie or a story. Um, but um, um, but let's talk about actually let's treat it that way. Actually, we are doing the movie version of Philip's life. Looking back, uh, you know, from the distant future, or possibly from the distant past when God's writing it together. What do you think is your destination? What is especially particularly this entrepreneurial quest that you're on?
I think there's maybe a couple of elements in this, and I'm talking out loud here. I haven't actually addressed this question on a individual level, but I would say my destination is to fulfill the purpose for which I was created. And, I think that the first part of that fulfillment is actually in an identity framework or relational framework where I am a father, I am a son, I am a friend, a husband, a brother, and there's something of my destination that isn't actually fully embodying and engaging who I'm created to be in those relationships. And so, um, loving my kids, being loved by God, loving my wife, being loved by my wife is a huge part of my destination. And there are obstacles that would stop me from getting there, things that seem to be more important than that. But then I would say also connected to that is a sense of uh, there's an interesting verse that we were created by God for good works, which he prepared in advance that we should walk in them. So I think there's actually like a thing that God created me to do, and discovering that and doing that is a significant part of understanding my story and reaching my destination.
Right. And good. And I think I should probably narrow the question down a little bit, because um, there's your personal story that you are living out in context of relationships. And for lack of a better term, let's call it the professional story,
Yeah.
uh, which is the thing that you are inviting other people into. And one of the best ways I've heard of framing that is, like, to answer the vision statement, a world where. Like, what is like, if you succeed in your professional quest, you will have created a world where dot, dot, dot.
Yeah. So I think, the journey that I'm setting out on a professional level is developing a framework and a clarity in language that enables people to see and understand their own stories, so that they can find resolution to their internal tension and understand their purpose and step into helping others resolve their internal tension. And so I think it's a connected to story, but it's specifically around individuals and their connected purposes, their businesses, their families, being able to find resolution and move forward healthier and stronger and more aligned to their purpose.
So it's a world where everyone has the tools to see and uncover um, meaningful and productive resolutions to their internal tensions. Something like
Correct.
that. Okay. Um, and there was another phrase that I was wanting to play with is that sometimes the resolution is a refinement, right? It's where you don't like, the like most like Star Wars, the first movie, they don't really resolve the tension of the Empire, but they've refined the tension, right? It's no longer about what are we going to do, it's how do we, there's a shift. I don't know what the right word for this is, right? Is that the tension doesn't disappear, but it's changed because you've achieved a milestone towards it.
Yeah, so there's multiple acts in a story, and you could treat each of the Star Wars movies as an individual
Mhm.
story, and it's really a combination of stories that are separate acts, and you can then treat the three or the six or the nine movies as even acts within the larger story. And so I would consider it to be progression. And there are stories where the end of the story is the story is progressed and there's resolution to it, an element of the story or several elements of the story while there's still unresolved tension around others. And so I think that's the um maybe the reality that we see in a trilogy and a multi-movie series is both a broader, grander story and a individual story. So
Yeah.
is that what
Yeah,
you're
so
talking?
I guess the sense right is that it can be a productive resolution without being the final resolution.
Yeah, and even the resolutions that we find in our own stories now, when I'm resolved and understanding my identity, it creates a focus point in my story that I can see my story through, because I'm going to continue to live that story, and that internal tension is still there as an opportunity for me to live in that internal tension again, or to continue to be free of it, comes from how much I understand what's going on. Because I think there are people that have moments of resolution and then they forget them and go back into where they were. And so it's a live thing that we're in. And this is the difference between lived story and told story. You have a story that you live, and that story is incredibly complex and layered and multifaceted and ongoing, versus a story you tell, which is a story where you say, I'm going to tell you where the beginning is and tell you where the end is and tell you what the meaning is in the story, from a perspective, putting certain information in and leaving other information out intentionally. That is, you could say it's almost false to the live story because it's so limited in its scope. But that is the nature of telling a good story, is that you're choosing certain elements to include, and you're assigning certain meanings to it, and you're creating a clear ending to it, even though that's just a version of it.
Yeah, what someone said is that our brain has both an experiential self and a remembered self, but unfortunately, the only one we have to work with is the remembered self. And it's very much there's various theories that all that actually exists is narrative, um, um, at a practical level. All right, I think we've got at least a good placeholder for the vision there. What are the key values? Like, what are the things that you will explicitly trade off against their opposite in order to get more of?
So I would say honesty is a significant value. Um, I might even use the word authenticity, though that word could mean different things to different people. But it's a sense that we are facing the facts, that we are facing reality, that we are addressing um, not what we want to be true, but what is true. And um, so if we're not being honest about our story, if we're not being honest about our hearts and where we're at, which this may seem like a just a choice again of to be honest, but there's also something of a uncovering or pursuit here, because we all see the world from a certain perspective, and so we have to be open to another perspective, or to seeing a shift in our perspective, to see our story differently. And so you might call this limiting beliefs, um, or lies, but this essentially this idea that we can see our story wrongly, and we can perceive it wrongly, and the journey to see it rightly requires a level of humility and honesty, that is seeking out what's true and what really happened. And obviously this is a bit subjective on some level, but I think there's enough objectivity in it that it's a real thing, that it's kind of like you just said, your remembered self. There is something about how do I actually see the world, and recognizing that the way you see the world might be inaccurate, and that it is both worth noting how you see it anyway, and it's worth being curious about where you might be wrong.
Yeah, out of all the words you use, the phrase uncovering limiting beliefs was the one I found most evocative and least triggering, right? Because like words like authenticity and honesty have so many meanings, some positive, some negative, some, whereas this passion for uncovering limiting beliefs is something that I think is, it implies strongly a particular worldview, and a worldview of challenging our own worldviews.
Well, and I could say the word clearly as a word lie, and lies are an accurate way to say it, but the reality of saying there is a lie is saying there is truth. And that might be harder for some people to grasp, but I do believe that a limiting belief is something we all can agree on, that I might think of myself as being less important than you, and that thinking of myself as less important than you will cause me to treat myself and treat you in a way that's limiting. And so, regardless of whether or not I believe there's a truth or not, I can see that I'm limiting myself by thinking of myself wrong.
Yeah, and it's particularly, it also implies there is a thing that you are going towards that this is limiting you against, which I think is the reality, is we all have an infinite number of contextually false beliefs, but understanding which ones are limiting us from making progress in the directions of what we actually care about.
Yeah.
So that's an awesome value. Um, any other strong values that come to mind? Especially things that are distinctive.
I think there's a value here, and maybe I'll talk for a minute and you'll pull out the word that you find least offensive, as you just did. I think there's a value here for humanity or for people, and that's a value for ourselves, and it's a value for others. And one word you might use here that again has lots of different meanings to different people is the word love. And I think it's this idea that we see stories as important because people are important. And so when we come into someone's story, we come in with a desire to value that person, to understand that person, to see that person, and that person may be myself. And I think we all struggle at times even to value our own selves and value our own stories. And we might say, well, my story is not worth telling, or it's not very good, or because I had a really rough beginning to my story, or because I'm in a current rough place in my story, that I have less value, or that someone else's story is more important. And so I think there's something in here around valuing people and valuing ourselves, and believing that, um, again, there's a potential for resolution in story. And so we're actually, and maybe I'm shifting here, but the word hope, where the idea of even seeing the world as a series of stories is the idea that tension will be resolved. And so something about someone's story that is incredibly broken and seems impossibly hard to resolve, that there is actual hope for resolution in that story. And I think that does guide us forward, saying we're not just trying to understand what has happened and grieve it. We're desiring to find meaning in it, and to find resolution and hope in it. Um, and that is true for both the stories of the people that we would consider heroes, or the people that have seemingly been successful, and those that we might consider villains, or that we might think are evil or wrong, and everywhere in between. And that actually, by valuing humanity, we're valuing we're recognizing the value that we have in ourselves, both in our successes and in our failures.
So I wrote that down as honoring and redeeming each person's story. Is that on the one hand, you want to make sure you're honoring everyone's story, including your own, including those you don't like, but then also seeking redemption of that story in the sense of hope. There's something else that's closely related to that, which I think is a passion of yours, which I'm going to call something like digging deep to discover meaning, right? There is, and I think this is possibly the most theistic part of it, the sense that there is a good meaning underlying reality that we need to uncover and refine, but it's already there, as opposed to something we have to create from scratch for ourselves or that doesn't exist at all. Yeah, you know, beliefs, story, and meaning are all very powerful terms.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's definitely something there in digging deeper. I think you're right in saying there is a declarative nature to what we're doing in saying there is meaning, there is value, and I'm unapologetic in saying that and looking for that and assuming it's there and just trying to find where it is versus saying, could we like think of maybe a challenging story as a trash heap, and we could be digging through the trash heap saying, could we make something good out of this? Could there be something that we could put together that would value this trash heap or bring meaning to this trash heap? And I think of it less as we're trying to find meaning and create it, and more of we're trying to discover meaning. And the reality is that there isn't a trash heap in anyone's story, that what you have is actually a purpose and something beautiful that's been broken, and that it needs to be understood and put back together, even if in a different way or in a restorative or transformative way, that it's not a collection of thrown out items, it's a collection of useful items that have been abused or broken.
Yeah, and I think that what I like about this is it's sort of an operational definition of divinity, right? Is that in order to people engage with you, like it doesn't matter their religious preferences, but do they believe that meaning is a thing that can be discovered? Because if they don't, then you're just going to frustrate each other, right? Whoever would discover meaning must believe that it exists and it rewards those who seek it.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, the ramifications of faith and belief. It would be interesting to see, because I think that story seems to be a universal heart language that everyone speaks. And I assign certain meanings to it, and I look at it from a certain perspective because of my faith. I don't know where the utility would be limited in dealing with someone that maybe sees the world differently. I think there are places that it could be, but I don't know.
Yeah, and there's differences, but it's like this is why you want to know the values of your own values, both for your own sake, but also so other people know, like, hey, this is what you're signing up for. Like, if you are going to defend all your beliefs, you don't want to honor other people's stories, and you don't think there's any meaning to be found, you will probably be really frustrated working with me, and vice
Yeah,
versa,
yeah,
right?
you might be directly opposing the efforts that I'm taking.
Right. And you may discover that consciously I might think I agree with you, and then subconsciously I fight you, but that's part of the story.
Well,
Uh,
I can think of at least one or two more values. Uh,
okay.
I don't know how many values I'm afforded. Um, I think the next value that I would say, and I'm trying to determine if this is two values or one, is that there is value in telling stories. There is value in hearing each other's stories and understanding each other's stories and in telling our own stories. And I think where this bleeds into potentially a different value is this reality that we are not alone, that there is a broader narrative that we are all a part of, and that this is not a question of each one of us trying to, separate from everyone else, uh, find and tell a story that's meaningful, but we're actually all a part of the same story. And we have individual elements of this story that are ours and our own stories, but then our stories connect with other stories and they relate and they overlap with other stories in a way that we can begin to understand we're not alone and that there's something bigger than any one of us out there. And I think it starts with the telling of our story, but it potentially ends with the meaning making of a larger story. Again, from a Christian perspective, there is a larger story with a larger storyteller who's weaving together these stories. And this would be certainly, if you were not looking from a religious perspective, a modernist claim, which has become quite popular actually, in lieu of postmodernism. We've now kind of arrived at metamodernism, which this assumption that I make my own meaning, and so I can oscillate between saying, in a sort of critical way, there is no meaning to the world, and then I can oscillate between that position and the position of there is meaning, there is beauty, and there is
Right.
life in the world.
Or at least I can have local meaning, even if there is no global meaning.
Yeah, well, it's this metamodernism is formed not by philosophers but by artists. And so in the wake of saying there is no meaning as a postmodernist, I then start to say, well, I'm going to go make meaning through art or through beauty, through music, and I can start to express things I'm feeling and seeing and experiencing. And at the most hopeful point of a metamodernist or a modern person is this reality of saying there is something bigger, there is something better, there is something grander, even if the next moment we then chide against it and say there is no meaning. And I am critical of larger narratives. I'm critical of culture or
Islands of sincerity in a sea of irony.
yes. And so this oscillation uh, is confusing in a certain sense, but it also shows that we're not willing to let go of beauty and art and meaning. And so if you look at the larger story being kind of a mystical expression of our individual stories kind of painted together in this mosaic, or if you see it as a story that's being told by a god, either way, there is this grander, bigger story that transcends our own individual stories.
Right. And there's even a thing where a sense of co-telling a story with God.
Yeah, the thing that's interesting about story is that story has a writer and it has a perspective. And you could tell, for example, the story of the Pilgrims coming to America, and there's many facts of that story that seem fairly well corroborated. And there's many stories coming from that time period that offer the perspective of the European settler. And then you have alongside of that stories told from the Native American indigenous people of America in that same time, overlaying the same facts, but with a different perspective. And so you ask the question, well, what is the truth of that story? And the reality is that there are two perspectives in that story. And so it's impossible to say this is the story without just only giving dates and times and factual things that happen. But story assigns meaning. Story offers perspective. And so it would be wrong to say that the story of the European settlers was a false story, but it would be right to say it was from a certain perspective. And in some ways, it conflicts with the perspective of the Native American. What I'm talking about then when we talk about perspective and understanding God's perspective in a story is realizing that we see our story a certain way, others see our story in a certain way, other characters in our story, but then there's also God and what he sees in our story. And so there's a question of, are we having a group project in our story where I sit down and I talk about it with the other characters in my story and God talks about it and we all bring our own individual meanings to that and try to make something of it? Do we separate them and say, this is my wife's perspective of this story, this is my perspective of this story, and then this is God's perspective of this story? And if there's a writer in the story, then that writer's perspective has a bigger view and a better understanding of why it was written that way. Though a character in the story, and we see this right when we watch a movie, sometimes we know more than the character does that's in the story. Other times the character knows more than we do. These are different perspectives that are aligning together, but the writer of the story, at least in it, unless you're watching the TV show Lost, where it seems that the writers were lost. It's most writers of the story, they have more information and they have better information than the characters in the story. And so if you overlay that onto our stories, if the writer is me, then I have the best information. But as I go in my story, I realize things and I look back and say, oh, I didn't see that from the right perspective. My assertion is that God is writing our stories and that he has the best information and the best perspective on it. And so
And I think that's an interesting question, whether that is an explicit part of your value system or whether that's implicitly contained in the other assumptions.
It's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, just leaving that as a wonder. I don't think we don't need to decide that. I got about 7 minutes, but I do want to at least touch on the third point. Do you have any other values, or do we think we cover those at least?
I put those two together, that we
Yeah.
should tell our stories and that there is a larger story.
Yeah, I just wrote that as better when we tell together, which is ambiguous, hopefully in the right way. Methods. What are the sorts of things that you see yourself doing to bring about this world?
So, I think a lot of what's going on here and how it came out for me is using the language that helps us tell a compelling story as a video. Using that language, and really this is born out of me working with people to try and tell their story using video, to say, I want to tell a good story. I want to tell a compelling story. And along that pathway, I am, like I think you said earlier, not just wanting to tell stories, but wanting to tell the stories that God's telling. And so there is a part of this journey in the methods that I've taken that it involves helping people see the elements of story and recognize those elements in their own life. But then there's also an element of asking God for his perspective on our story. And there's a prayer or a listening aspect of it where we say, okay, what is your perspective as the writer on my story, and what is important and what you want to be told? That brings a focus point to our own perception of self.
Right. So I picked up at least 3 things. One is telling stories for others. The other is giving people the tools to tell their own story. And the third is creating space to hear God's story.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And then there's an implicit one here, which I'm curious whether I hinted at this, which is why we're having this conversation, which is telling your own story in a way others can learn from.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we'll need to do to reach our destination is help people reflect on their story, maybe in a dynamic way, but that brings a clarity to a story they could tell. And I think the hope would be that they would tell a story, and that would lead to them seeing the many stories that they can tell and developing a better set of tools to reflect on and tell stories.
All right. A couple minutes left to wrap up. Trying to think what the best way to land this is. Do we do prayer and communion? Do we do a summary? Do we do next steps? Can kind of go any direction on this.
Yeah, I think maybe what could be interesting to talk about is what's the way forward. Like what would be part 2 to this conversation, or maybe where do you envision what we're doing? Where is it headed? which you could argue maybe we could have done that at the beginning, but identifying both for you and for me and for potential viewers, what are we doing?
Yeah, that's good. So I'll tell you what I think, which is that I sort of think of this as like as a season, and the way I've been doing seasons typically is like six episodes and then a reflection, which also takes us close to the end of the year. And so I think the thing we're doing is coming up with is setting you up to launch in January. I guess whatever this thing is, that you have a clear sense of what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and how you explain it to other people.
Yeah, so it's helping me reflect on and build rightly to start a business that offers a valuable service and a valuable offering and a clear offering to people. And so working out, what do I know? What do I not know? What's clear? What's not clear? And there's the first step of saying, well, what is it? And then there's the second step of saying, how do I tell people what it is?
Right. Yeah. So in terms of homework, if you're up for it, you'll get a Fathom. And I have my notes in the chat as well. Do you want to take a stab at writing down like the first three that we discussed into just putting them into a Google Doc or something? The destination, the vision, values, and methods.
Oh, those three. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. I can work on that.
And then we can review that at the beginning and then dive into the next two. And if you feel inspired, you can start taking notes. Otherwise, we can just riff on it.
And just for my sake, V2MOM framework, I feel like that's an acronym that connects with your business. Is that right?
No, I got this from Salesforce, actually.
Okay. I get it now. It's vision, values, methods, obstacles, measures. And
yeah.
this is a framework that helps what?
The goal is to provide organizational clarity for stakeholders. And the difference between this is that it talks about obstacles and measures, which typically aren't part of the usual mission statements, to give it more operational. Like, okay, but what's the hard part you have to solve to actually pull this off, and how will you know if you've done it? And that's what we'll kind of focus on the next time.
Cool. I like that.
All right, I'll send you some links and talk to you in a couple of weeks. Of course, I'm sure I'll run into you before then as well.
Yep. Sounds
right.
good.
God bless you, bro. Bye-bye.
You too.